Hello, everyone. I am here with Dr. Angela Borozna, who co-wrote a book with Lada Kochieva, War by Other Means, Western Sanctions on Russia and Moscow's Response. Angela, thank you so much for joining us. Can you start by telling the audience a little bit about your academic and professional background?
Hello, everyone. I'm a lecturer of political science at the Department of Politics, Administration and Justice. I'm originally from Russia, so here comes my interest in everything Russian. I used to work in finance before I got my PhD degree in political science. I used to work in finance, and that brought me to Washington, D.C., New York, London, San Francisco. Before that, I worked for an NGO in Washington, D.C., where I worked on projects related to Russia and Ukraine. And they were dealing with basically a transition to democracy. So my interest in overall Russia, Ukraine, and everything related to it comes also from that period. That was 1990s, and it was an interesting time. So after I got my PhD, I published a book on Russian foreign policy, and following that, I decided to expand on it, and war in Ukraine started in 2022, and sanctions were imposed shortly after. So me and my co-author, we met at the conference, actually, on International Studies Conference, and we decided to explore what all the sanctions is all about and how they hurt or don't hurt Russia.
Wonderful. And can you, let's just do some kind of basic definitional work. What is a sanction? Can you kind of tell us what sanctions are? What have they been historically? When have they been used? Can you give us a brief history?
Okay, sanctions can be seen as an instrument of coercive diplomacy. It's a political tool. Most of the time it is a political tool to impose pressure on the targeted state to change its behavior, either domestic politics or foreign policy stance. Obviously, in case of Russia, that was the main interest was to change its foreign policy stance regarding Ukraine. Sanctions are used, there is a long history actually of using sanctions. We can talk about we can look back 2,500 years ago during Peloponnesian Wars. Athens imposed a blockade on Sparta, and Sparta imposed a blockade on Athens, which led to eventual downfall of Athens, one might argue. The sanctions were used in 18th century, 19th century, but the most 20th century we started seeing the most use of sanctions. Actually, Woodrow Wilson was the first one who basically became the biggest proponent of sanctions. He said, in 1919, he said, we don't need to go to war, we don't need to lose soldiers, we can stifle the economy, we can basically strangle the economy of the state by imposing sanctions. And lives would be lost, but we don't lose any soldiers. So that's, and in 21st century we see acceleration in the use of sanctions. And in fact, the United States is the biggest imposer of sanctions on the world. And right now, half of the world population lives under sanctions. Yeah. Yes.
Now, your main focus in this book is sanctions against Russia, both sanctions in 2014 and 2022. How do you see these particular sanctions differ in this whole large context of sanctions?
So the initial round of sanctions was imposed in 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea. So the main focus of those sanctions were basically to change Russia's behavior toward Ukraine and possibly withdraw from Crimea. Well, we know that that didn't happen. But the main focus was on Russia's energy industry, defense, and anything related to military. In 2014, in 2022, sanctions were also targeting the same sectors, but they became more comprehensive. They actually expanded. So basically, every sector of Russian economy was under sanctions. They became so comprehensive that some authors compared it to economic carpet bombing because they were so inclusive, and they didn't target just economics. They targeted cultural exchange. For example, many concerts were cancelled with Russian participation. They banned Russian sports teams from competition, from Olympics. If you would go to Metropolitan Museum of Art, they changed even titles of some paintings. When it says about painting born in Russia, they would take it away. They just would put, for example, Moscow, Leningrad, but they wouldn't mention Russia. So the name Russia became so unacceptable. Yes. What else? It also affected tourism, air travel. So Russians were basically banned from European capitals. So the whole spectrum of sanctions became basically more comprehensive. But the main point was to bring the Russian war machine down, so to speak. So Biden said, we will strangle Putin, we will stop his war machine. That was the ultimate goal. Another difference is that in 2014, Russia was not prepared for sanctions, so it kind of was taken by surprise, and it took a couple years for the Russian economy to adjust. And because of that, so those sanctions were kind of more effective in the sense that they inflicted more pain. But in 2022, Russian economy already kind of adjusted to sanctions, and that's why the blow of them was not as harsh, was not as effective as it was anticipated.
Yeah, and I think one of the amazing things about your book is just how you so systematically go through different industries, go through how different Western countries, implemented the sanctions. It's a really, really impressive deep dive of those specifics. Say a little bit more about the effectiveness of these sanctions against Russia. You started to talk about it, but I wanted to give you a chance to say a little more.
So in general, sanctions are effective when a broad coalition of states come together, unite, and inflict a kind of joint pain. So the more countries unite in imposition of sanctions, the more effective they are. We see that in 2022, more countries came together to impose the sanctions on Russia. But overall, it was only 35 out of a total number of states, like about 200. So there is still a large number of states that didn't come together. And because of that, Russia was able to adjust. It was able to reorient its economy from trading with the West, and especially with Europe, to non-Western countries. So there is various techniques of adaptation that Russia adopted. For example, it started diverting of gas to China and India, Turkey, partially. Many of the critical components for its military machine are coming from secondary or third states. And that was actually one of the challenges to trace the effectiveness of sanctions, is because very often these components, they don't even register anywhere. At the same time, we have a shadow fleet. For example, the trade of energy is happening in the sea through shadow fleet. Very often transponders are turned off, so you cannot possibly trace the energy flowing. And those critical components, again, they very often come to Russia from the third states. They come under different categories, so there is no way to trace them. So some economists, for example, say that trade in those components went down by 60%. But it is known that Russia doesn't register them under this category. So they still come in the country, and since we see the performance in Ukraine, Russia still get these components. So these former post-Soviet states, former republics of the Soviet Union, such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, they became really instrumental for Russia's avoidance of sanctions. Because they traditionally traded, they have very strong ties, they continued this support of Russia. And by indirect indicators, if we look at imports of various components from Europe to those states, we see that, for example, import of cars went really over to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. And that's an indicator that it's going from those countries to Russia at some point.
Should we just end the sanctions then? Like, I'm going off a little off script, but if you were an advisor to the U.S. government, would you, and they're like, should we continue the sanction thing with Russia? Like, what would you advise?
Well, the reason I call this book War by Other Means is because sanctions in general, there is a really extensive research on sanctions that shows that they sometimes cause more damage than wars themselves. If we look at the case of Iraq, 500,000 children died as a result of sanctions on Iraq. So sanctions could be really brutal. And there is a case to be said that sanctions are immoral because they hurt population more than they hurt elites. So the ultimate goal of sanctions, of course, is to pressure elites. But elites rarely change their course. If we look at Cuba, Iran, North Korea, regimes don't change their policies as a result of sanctions. They're really unsuccessful in producing policy change. So in that respect, what do I recommend in terms of sanctions? Sanctions are ineffective too. I think we should focus on diplomacy, and I think diplomacy is lacking. So I think the United States would benefit from maybe strengthening its diplomatic core in general, kind of revamping its diplomacy, because the ultimate go-to tool became punishment. So instead of coercion, I think we should talk on dialogue and diplomacy. And since sanctions is a way of economic war, for all practical purposes, I'm against any war. So I think we should kind of veer away from war and start talking diplomacy.
Thank you for that. For people in your field who study the effectiveness of sanctions, and I know what you've produced here, like I don't know how many peers you feel like you really have who've done this level of research, but how controversial do you think this argument is? Would most people who study this agree with your statement that sanctions are largely ineffective if your goal is to do something in a bloodless way?
Well, again, as I said, I think we should focus on diplomacy, and but there is of course, there is always a group of analysts that still prefer putting pressure on governments. I think we should. I really think we should go away from sanctions, and the research shows that sanctions are effective in about 25-30% of cases, and most of the time they're effective when a country is really dependent, when it's not self-sustainable, smaller economies. With countries like Russia, that's virtually over the period of Cold War was self-sustaining economy. So it became really easy to switch back to this model of economy. So you cannot impose sanctions on an integrated country like Russia and expect a change. It's interesting, actually, the lack of understanding how Russia works or its actual economy. For example, Barack Obama at some point stated that Russia is a great power masquerading. No, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a great power. That's what he said. But in fact, if we look, Russia is very integrated into the world economy. It's not only trading energy, though this is the kind of the common argument that Russia is only trading raw materials and resources. Because of this integration into the world economy, it hurts not only Russia itself, but countries involved. And if we look at Europe, for example, the prices of gas, by some estimates, like 4 or 5 times higher than in the United States. Price of electricity 2 to 3 times higher than in the United States. So the competitiveness of European economy went down, especially Germany. Germany is really hurt as a result of those sanctions. So there is this blowback effect from sanctions, and so when politicians consider sanctions, they should think twice, and they should think how it will affect the sender countries themselves. So not only targeted countries involved, but the sender country, and especially in case of integrated economy like Russia.
Thank you so much. Final question. What are you gonna research next? I think you also have this storied career of not just academia, but working in other fields. So I can't choose the last question. So I think either if you want to tell the audience about future research plans or any advice to people who are deciding whether to go into academia or into other careers, either one of those.
Well, my other interest is actually competition in the Arctic, and I actually wrote an article this year on Russia's threat perceptions in the Arctic, because the melting of the ice in the Arctic, it opens new opportunities, and great powers kind of looking for to put a, so to speak, flag in the North Pole. But Russia has been traditionally Arctic power, because 20% of Russian territory actually lies in the Arctic Circle. So it believes that it's a kind of legitimate power in the region. But China, for example, claimed itself new Arctic power. I mean, it's interesting, of course, it's not really in vicinity, but it considers itself new Arctic power. So there is a great competition coming up in the Arctic region, and that's why my next project.
Well, congratulations on your new book, and thank you so much for being here to talk to us. As a thank you, a little box that represents your book. All right, we will be gathering in 5 minutes to discuss Elise Wong's book about felony procedure in Middle English literature.